I didn't say a word when the HOA president slammed her hand on the conference table and demanded I remove my pet from the premises immediately. I just reached into my folder, pulled out the Department of Veterans Affairs accommodation letter with the federal seal, and slid it across the polished wood surface. The way her face went from righteous anger to pale confusion in about 3 seconds was almost worth the 6 months of hell she'd put my wife through. Almost before all this started, life was actually pretty good for the first time in years. Sarah and I had finally found our rhythm after she came back from her 3rd deployment in Afghanistan. The transition hadn't been easy. 3 tours as a combat medic had left her with injuries you could see and ones you couldn't. She'd taken shrapnel in her left leg during a rocket attack on their forward operating base, and the physical therapy had been brutal, but the invisible wounds were worse. The hypervigilance that made crowded spaces feel like combat zones, the nightmares that had her checking locks 3 times before bed, the way sudden loud noises could send her diving for cover behind our couch. But we'd made it work, one day at a time. We bought a small house in Meadowbrook Estates because it was quiet, had excellent proximity to the Veterans Hospital where Sarah did her therapy twice a week, and the HOA seemed reasonable enough when we toured. The sales agent had been a veteran, herself Navy, 2 deployments to the Gulf, and she'd walked us through the community with genuine pride. The streets were wide and well-maintained. The neighbors kept their properties neat without being obsessive about it. And there was a peaceful walking trail that wound around a small pond where Sarah could decompress after her appointments. Sarah loved a little garden plot behind our kitchen window, spending hours researching which vegetables grew best in our zone and carefully planning her layout on graph paper. I loved watching her plant tomatoes with the same focused intensity she'd once used to save lives under fire. Her hands steady and sure as she measured spacing and checked soil composition. For the first time since she'd been home, she was sleeping through most nights without medication, and her therapist had started reducing the frequency of their sessions. We'd found something that felt like peace. Sarah's service dog, Ranger, was a 3-year-old German Shepherd who'd been trained specifically for her needs through a program run by Veterans Community Living Centers in Colorado. The training process had taken 18 months and cost more than most people's cars, but the VA had covered it because Sarah's case was severe enough to qualify for their specialized assistance program. Ranger could sense her PTSD episodes before they peaked, detecting the subtle changes in her breathing and body language that preceded a panic attack. He could guide her to safe spaces when her anxiety spiked in crowded areas, using his body to create buffer zones and lead her toward exits. Most importantly, he provided deep pressure therapy during her worst nights, his 80-pound frame providing the weighted comfort that helped regulate her nervous system when the nightmares hit. Ranger wasn't a pet, he was medical equipment with fur, legally protected under federal law and essential to Sarah's daily functioning. His training was more extensive than most police dogs, covering everything from crowd navigation to medical alert responses. He'd been taught to recognize the signs of Sarah's specific triggers and respond accordingly, whether that meant creating physical barriers between her and crowds, alerting to incoming anxiety attacks, or simply providing the steady, grounding pressure she needed to stay connected to the present moment. When we moved in, I'd provided all the proper documentation to the HOA management company, Sarah's psychiatric evaluation from the VA, detailing her service-connected disabilities and medical need for assistance, Ranger's certification from the International Association of Assistance Dog Partners, including his training records and behavioral assessments, the relevant sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act, highlighted and annotated to make it crystal clear that this wasn't a request, it was a federally protected accommodation. The management company had accepted the paperwork without question, filed it away in our homeowner packet, and confirmed in writing that everything was in order. For 8 months, everything was peaceful in a way that felt almost miraculous after years of stress and uncertainty. Sarah would walk Ranger through the neighborhood in the early mornings when fewer people were around and the air was still cool from the night. He wore his clearly marked service dog vest, bright blue with reflective patches that read medical, alert dog, do not pet or distract, and maintained the perfect controlled heel that marked him as professionally trained. He never bothered anyone, never barked at other dogs or squirrels, never pulled on his leash or investigated garbage cans like regular pets might. The neighbors were generally friendly and respectful. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down would wave from her kitchen window during Sarah's morning walks and occasionally brought over vegetables from her garden. The Johnsons across the street had a son who'd served in the Marines, and they'd sometimes chat with Sarah about base experiences and veteran resources in the area. Most people understood what Ranger was and why he was there. The vest made it obvious, and Sarah's polite but brief explanations about her military service usually satisfied any curious questions. We kept our yard immaculate because Sarah found the routine therapeutic and because we wanted to be good neighbors. Our grass was always mowed to exactly the right height. Our flower beds were weeded religiously, and our driveway was pressure washed monthly. We paid our HOA dues early every quarter, attended exactly 0 HOA meetings because we just wanted to be left alone to build our quiet life, and never complained about anything even when the neighbor's sprinklers occasionally overspayed onto our car. Life felt stable in a way it hadn't since before Sarah's first deployment. She was sleeping better, eating regularly again, and had even started talking about maybe taking some college classes online. Her therapist at the VA had commented on how much progress she'd made since moving to Meadowbrook, attributing the improvement to the stability of routine and the calming environment. For the first time in years, we were planning more than a few weeks ahead, talking about things like vacation destinations and home improvement projects. Sarah had started researching fruit trees for our backyard, excited about the idea of planting something that would grow and produce for years to come. Then Margaret Chen got elected HOA president, and our peaceful life evaporated like morning dew in August heat. Margaret was one of those people who treated volunteer positions like personal kingdoms. She'd moved to Meadowbrook 3 years earlier, after her divorce. A bitter woman in her late 50s who seemed to channel all her frustrations into micromanaging other people's lives. She'd run for the board position on a platform of restoring community standards, which apparently meant enforcing rules that hadn't been problems for anyone until she decided they were. During her campaign, she'd knocked on doors with a clipboard, documenting violations that previous boards had ignored as minor. Cosmetic issues, mailbox colors that were technically off-spec, fence heights that exceeded limits by inches, garden borders that extended to feet past approved boundaries. But Margaret's real specialty was finding loopholes and gray areas in the community covenants that she could exploit to harass people she didn't like. She'd studied those documents like a law student cramming for finals, annotating every section, and cross-referencing enforcement precedents from other HOAs. Within a week of taking office, she'd hired a new management company that specialized in aggressive enforcement and started issuing violation notices for things that had been overlooked for years. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, typed on official letterhead and taped to our front door like an eviction notice. Violation notice: unauthorized pet in violation of community standards, section 4.12b. You have 10 days to remove the animal or face daily fines of $50. I read it twice, certain there had been some mistake. Section 4.12b was the standard no pets clause, but it specifically exempted service animals, which I knew because I'd read every word of those covenants before we signed the purchase agreement. I'd even highlighted the relevant exceptions and kept copies in our homeowner file. The notice included no mention of Ranger's status as a service dog, no reference to the documentation we'd provided, no acknowledgement that federal law superseded HOA pet policies. It was written as if Ranger were just a regular dog that we'd smuggled in against community rules. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a line that made my blood pressure spike. Appeals must be submitted in writing within 5 business days with supporting documentation and a $200 processing fee. I called the management company that afternoon. The woman who answered seemed genuinely confused when I explained the situation and promised to look into it. 2 hours later, she called back sounding apologetic. Mr. Rodriguez, I'm so sorry. There seems to be a miscommunication. Your service dog documentation is right here in your file. I'll send a note to Mrs. Chen immediately. The second letter arrived 3 days later. Same tone, same threat, same complete disregard for federal law. This time it included a grainy photo of Sarah and Ranger taken from someone's window, with evidence of continued violations stamped across it in red ink. Sarah found that one when she got home from her therapy appointment at the VA. I watched her hands shake as she read it, and something cold settled in my stomach when I realized she was starting to avoid her morning walks. I decided to try the diplomatic approach first. I drafted a careful email to Mrs. Chen, attaching copies of every relevant document, Ranger's certification from the International Association of Assistance Dog Partners, Sarah's accommodation letters from the VA, and a simplified explanation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I kept the tone respectful and educational, assuming this was just ignorance that could be corrected with information. Her response came back within an hour. Service dogs are still dogs. Our community has standards. Find another place to live or get rid of it. That's when I knew we were dealing with something more than ignorance. The harassment escalated quickly after that. Margaret began showing up to our property with a measuring tape and a camera, documenting every perceived violation she could manufacture. Sarah's flower beds were non-compliant garden modifications. Our mailbox needed repainting because of minor scuff marks. The small American flag Sarah had hung by our front door was improperly sized according to patriotic display guidelines, a rule I couldn't find anywhere in the actual covenants. But the focus always came back to Ranger. Margaret would follow Sarah during her walks, staying exactly 20 feet behind and taking photos. She'd call animal control with false reports about an aggressive, unleashed dog. forcing us to waste afternoons proving Ranger's training and documentation. 2 increasingly annoyed officers. She started scheduling emergency board meetings whenever she saw Sarah leave the house with Ranger, claiming his presence on common areas was disruptive to community peace. The breaking point came in June. Sarah was having a particularly bad day, the kind where crowded spaces triggered her anxiety and loud noises sent her into fight-or-flight mode. She'd taken Ranger to the small community park at the end of our street, just the 2 of them, because it was usually empty during weekday afternoons. Ranger was doing his job, providing deep pressure therapy by leaning against her legs while she practiced the breathing techniques her therapist had taught her. Margaret appeared with 2 other board members and a security guard I'd never seen before. She demanded Sarah leave immediately because aggressive animals weren't allowed in common areas. When Sarah tried to explain that Ranger was performing medical tasks, Margaret cut her off and threatened to have them both arrested for trespassing. The security guard looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Sarah came home shaking, and that night was the first time in months I heard her crying in the bathroom with the door closed. That's when I stopped sending polite emails and started reading federal law. I spent the next 2 weeks buried in legal research, and what I found made my blood run cold with anger and anticipation. The Fair Housing Act doesn't just protect service dogs, it makes what Margaret was doing a federal crime. Housing discrimination based on disability carries penalties starting at $19,787 for first-time violations and escalating to $98,935 for repeat offenses. But for cases involving deliberate, systematic harassment of disabled veterans, the Department of Housing and Urban Development had consistently pushed for maximum penalties and additional punitive damages. What made Margaret's situation even worse was the paper trail she'd created. Every violation notice, every threatening email, every false report to animal control was documented evidence of willful violation of federal civil rights law. Under HUD guidelines, ignorance of the law might reduce penalties for first-time offenders. But the systematic nature of Margaret's harassment campaign eliminated any possibility of claiming innocent mistakes. But I didn't stop there. I started digging into Margaret's background and the HOA's governance practices, and what I discovered was a pattern of abuse that went far beyond us. Margaret had forced out 3 other families in the past 2 years using similar tactics: manufacturing violations, escalating harassment, creating hostile living conditions until people sold their homes just to escape. The Martinez family had been targeted over their teenage son's pickup truck, which Margaret claimed violated aesthetic vehicle standards. The elderly Patels had been fined repeatedly for non-compliant landscaping, because their garden included vegetables alongside flowers. Most recently, she'd driven out a young single mother by claiming her evening work schedule created excessive noise disturbances. Each case followed the same pattern, identifying targets who seemed vulnerable or different, finding technical violations that could be weaponized, then escalating enforcement until the harassment became unbearable. The HOA's legal fund had been depleted, paying settlements to previous targets who'd hired attorneys, which explained why the current board was so aggressive about avoiding actual legal scrutiny. They couldn't afford to lose another discrimination case. More importantly, I found out that Margaret's own compliance record was far from perfect. Her backyard pool had been installed without proper county permits, missing required safety inspections, and violating setback requirements. Her decorative fence exceeded height restrictions by 8 inches along the entire back boundary of her property. Her driveway extension violated setback requirements by 3 feet and had been poured without submitting architectural plans for approval. Most egregiously, she'd converted part of her garage into a home office without obtaining the proper zoning permits, technically operating an unlicensed business in a residential area. All issues that had somehow never resulted in violation letters. From her own board, I documented everything methodically. Photos of Margaret's violations, screenshots of her emails, recordings of her threatening phone calls to Sarah. I filed a formal complaint with HUD, contacted the VA's Legal Assistance Program, and reached out to a disability rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination. But I didn't tell Margaret any of this was coming. The final board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in July. Margaret had put community standards enforcement on the agenda, and I knew she planned to formally demand our eviction. Sarah didn't want to go. She'd barely left the house in weeks, except for her VA appointments, but Di convinced her that this would be the last time we'd have to deal with Margaret's harassment. The community room was packed with neighbors who'd been told there was a dangerous dog situation that needed community input. Margaret sat at the head table with her usual smug confidence, a thick folder of evidence spread in front of her. She started her presentation with photos of Ranger walking peacefully beside Sarah, describing him as an uncontrolled animal that threatens community safety. I let her talk for 10 minutes. Let her dig the hole deeper with every word about how so-called service dogs were just pets people used to circumvent reasonable community standards. Let her explain how property values would suffer if they allowed exceptions for every sob story. I watched the faces in the crowd, seeing neighbors I'd thought were reasonable, nodding along with her rhetoric. Then, I stood up. Mrs. Chen, before this goes any further, I have something you should see. I walked to the front of the room and placed a single document on the table in front of her. It was the HUD investigation notice, officially informing the HOA that they were under federal investigation for disability discrimination and housing violations. The case number was prominently displayed at the top. Along with the investigator's contact information, the room went completely silent as Margaret read the first few lines. I watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror as she realized what she was looking at. This investigation was triggered by your 6-month campaign of harassment against my wife, a decorated combat veteran, and her federally protected service dog. I said quietly, every email you sent, every false report you filed, every violation notice you fabricated is now evidence in a federal civil rights case. The penalties start at $100,000. But given the documented pattern of harassment against a disabled veteran, HUD's attorneys are pushing for the maximum. I turned to address the room. What Mrs. Chen didn't tell you is that my wife served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan as a medic. She saved lives under enemy fire and came home with injuries that require the assistance of a trained service dog. What Mrs. Chen also didn't tell you is that her own property has multiple code violations that somehow never resulted in the harassment she subjected us to. I placed a second set of photos on the table. Margaret's unpermitted pool, her oversized fence, her illegal driveway extension. The county inspector will be visiting Mrs. Chen's property tomorrow morning. Turns out, when you make federal agencies pay attention to HOA governance, they notice all kinds of interesting patterns. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. This isn't over. Actually, it is, I replied. The federal investigation is just getting started, but our part is done. Sarah and I are moving next month. We found a house in a neighborhood that actually welcomes veterans instead of persecuting them. But you'll be dealing with HUD's attorneys for the next few years. And given that this HOA's insurance specifically excludes coverage for civil rights violations, those legal bills will be coming out of community funds. I gathered my papers and helped Sarah to her feet. Ranger, who'd been lying quietly beside her chair throughout the entire meeting, stood and automatically positioned himself for support as we walked toward the door. The room was so quiet you could hear our footsteps on the cheap carpet. Just before we reached the exit, I turned back one more time. Oh, and Margaret, the Veterans Organization Legal Fund has been looking for a good test case on HOA discrimination. Congratulations, you're famous now. 3 weeks later, Margaret resigned from the board. 2 months after that, she put her house up for sale. The HOA's insurance carrier dropped them entirely once the federal investigation became public, and the remaining board members spent the next year scrambling to find legal representation they could actually afford. Sarah and I closed on our new house on a Tuesday in September. It's in a neighborhood where half the residents are veterans or active military, and our next-door neighbor's wife also has a service dog. When Sarah walks Ranger in the mornings now, she comes home relaxed instead of anxious. She started sleeping through the night again. Sometimes I drive past our old neighborhood when I'm heading to the VA hospital with Sarah. The Meadowbrook Estates sign looks smaller somehow, and there's always at least 3 houses with for sale signs. Margaret's old place has been on the market for 8 months now. Turns out buyers do their research when they see federal discrimination cases in the property records. I'd never wanted to be the guy who destroyed an HOA. I just wanted my wife to be able to live peacefully with the medical equipment she needs to function. But when someone decides to wage war against a disabled veteran, they should probably make sure they're not violating federal law in the process. The Americans with Disabilities Act has teeth, and sometimes those teeth bite back harder than people expect. Now Sarah plants vegetables in our backyard without measuring setbacks, and Ranger sleeps in whatever patch of sunshine he prefers. Some battles choose you, and when they do, the only thing that matters is making sure you win completely, enough that no one else has to fight the same fight. Margaret learned that the hard way, but at least she learned it.